Hello, History 363. So today we're going to be talking about early Rome and the start of the Roman Republic. So in the last video, we talked about the sort of origin story of the Roman Republic, this sort of folklore story about the rape of Lucretia, which enrages the Roman people, and so they drive out the last king, Tarquin Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. Now, I'll be honest, I think this is pure folklore. I don't think Lucretia was a real person, or at least I highly doubt that Lucretia was a real person, and you can build a time machine and prove me wrong. I do generally agree that the Roman Republic is likely founded in the late 6th century BC, the year 509. We're not sure that our chronology is necessarily completely accurate right there. Some people have noted that that seems to be a little too convenient with the time that the Athenian democracy is founded, with the overthrow of the last Pisistrated tyrant. So there may be some attempt to kind of make Greek and Roman chronology sort of mesh up. But nonetheless, without question, Rome goes from being ruled by kings, and again, we have, aside from the Roman tradition, independent evidence of Rome being ruled by kings, and things like the Lapis Niger, which mentions the role of a Rex. And of course, we also have some evidence for the kingship being embedded in later Roman religious practice. The Romans have a priest that continues well into the imperial period called the Rex Sacrament, the king of sacred things. And the fact that there's sort of this vestigial priesthood, probably I would buy the explanation that the king had a package of religious obligations. For some reason, in the late 6th century, the Roman aristocrats overthrow the last king, but then they say, oh gosh golly, what are we going to do? The king did all these important religious and ritual things, and they said, we're going to create a king for sacred things, a king, a Rex Sacrorum, and that continues to operate. And of course, there's a building in the Forum called the Regia, the royal building. So we have the foundation of a republic. Now, one thing I think is very important to note, like up to now, I've been telling you nice, wonderful folkloric stories. We really don't have historical sources for the early Roman Republic, and this, in no small part, is because the Romans did not start writing history as a genre, until around 200 BC. So the first time the Romans actually tried to craft a narrative telling about what had happened, it's 200 BC, so 300 years before, 300 years after the Roman Republic was reputedly founded. To sort of just think about that, imagine if, after 1776, the first time anyone wrote a history of the American Revolution and what came afterwards, imagine that was in, say 2076, right? We'd still be waiting for the first American history if American history started being written on the same timeline as Roman history. So it's over 300 years after the foundation of the Republic that we have the first history, a historian named Fabius Pictor. That history, incidentally, doesn't survive. We just have little fragments, little quotations of it. So when we do have long narrative histories by Livy, I mean, Livy, book 1 through 5, covers the early years of the Republic, but he's relying on things other than written history, likely relying on folklore, on civic myth, perhaps relying on a very small number of written documents, things like the Lapis Niger. There may have been magistrate lists that were maintained that listed who was the magistrates for each year, the consuls. But it also means that the Romans may not have had a particularly good understanding of what was going on institutionally. So again, our sources for early Roman history are very poor. Indeed, there's a huge amount of debate amongst historians who work on early Rome of how much should we just see this as basically kind of fictional elaboration, and how much should we actually say, they actually did get some of the basics that happened. Perhaps there were kind of rudimentary records we know that there were some rudimentary records maintained by the Pontifex Maximus that listed very simple things like campaigns, magistrates, sometimes the price of wheat, and that some of these records may have survived into a later point to inform later historians. Maybe not Livy, the historian that we can read today, but sources that Livy used. So it's possible that when we hear that in a certain year there was a campaign against the Volscians, that's accurate, even if we may not be able to actually rely on any of the military details on that campaign, that a later historian trained in the art of rhetorical elaboration might have filled in to kind of flush out his history. So suffice it to say, our sources for early Rome are problematic, and it's very difficult to say anything with confidence. And again, you will run into historians who say, really, we can't start talking about anything Roman until some goes like as late as the 3rd century BC. I do believe that some of our basic framework may be correct, that enough good information was preserved in magisterial lists, in brief sort of notices, or even in oral tradition, which sometimes can be screwed, but sometimes can also preserve reasonably decent information. So again, we should approach this period critically, and it's a matter of personal preference to a degree that we, the amount of faith that we place in the sources that we do have. Nonetheless, I do think we can say a few basic things about the early Republic. One, in the early Republic, Rome was not an expansionary state, nor a particularly successful one. Now, we have, again, in the early books of Livy, quite detailed, and at times maybe too detailed, descriptions of Roman military operations. And in Livy, the Romans usually win pretty thumping victories most of the time. There's, of course, a few notable defeats, but in Livy, the enemies are really roughly handled. That being said, there's a pattern that emerges in Livy when he talks, particularly in the 5th century, and that is the Romans fight the same damn enemies again and again and again. They fight the Etruscans, who are right there to the north. They fight the Aequi and the Volscians, the Aequi being kind of more to the west, living up in the Apennine highlands, and the Volscians living in the volcanic highlands to the south. They fight these same enemies again and again and again, and the fact that they never really beat them suggests that maybe the Romans are able to hold the line, but they're not able to truly dominate even immediate neighbors militarily. Also, until 396, there is no real evidence of major Roman expansion. A little bit here and there on the frontiers, but for the most part, the Roman state is not an expansionary state during the 5th century. So while Rome will eventually have this very dangerous military system, that doesn't seem to be in place in the 5th century. Rome is at most holding the line, and oftentimes is more trying to keep invaders out than actually trying to expand vis-a-vis its neighbors. Now, we do hear that the early Republic faces several immediate military challenges. Supposedly, almost very shortly after the foundation of the Republic, an Etruscan king named Lars Porsena invades. And this invasion produces another Roman folk hero, one that was known to Polybius. And Polybius actually says that this story is told to inspire courage and valor in Roman youths. And this is the hero Horatius Cocles, Horatius at the bridge. And the story basically is the Etruscans are invading. They're trying to punch across the bridge over the Tiber, and Horatius single-handedly defends the bridge until so the soldiers behind him are breaking it up, and then he is cast into the water, and Polybius seems to think he drowns, but Livy tells a later kind of happier version where he managed to swim to the other side and survive. So this is again he's a kind of folk hero, may be a real person. We're told that this story continues to be told by oral tradition, again, as a way of exemplifying what a good, brave, self-sacrificial Roman soldier, how he behaves. There is a tradition that was known to the Emperor Claudius. The Emperor Claudius, who rules in the 50s,
41 to 54 AD.
54 BC.
Nope, AD.
He was a historian, and he was aware of a tradition that Lars Porsena had conquered the city. Perhaps. It does seem that one feature of Italian politics at this time is a lot of kind of roving itinerant warlords who from time to time kind of perch upon communities. So if Lars Porsena did conquer Rome, he didn't last very long. He suffers a defeat against the Latin League and goes back to his home. He's an Etruscan warlord from Clusium. But there is actually a version that maybe Horatius wasn't successful, and that the Romans suffer some kind of setback very early on after the expulsion of the last king. There also seems to be a challenge by the Latin communities to the south, who revolt in the early 5th century, and according to Roman tradition are defeated at a great, if poorly described, battle at Lake Regillus. And supposedly the Romans are aided by the appearance of the Dioscuri, the heavenly twins Castor and Pollux, who make an epiphany on the battlefield. Notable that the Romans are already, from this early point, importing a Greek cultural package. The Dioscuri are Greek gods, actually heavily associated with the Spartans. But now the Romans are claiming them as proof of divine favor. So suffice to say, the Romans face sort of military trials and tribulations right from the start of the Republic. They really won't start being more militarily successful until the early 4th century BC. So this is a period of kind of military, again, if not stagnation, just holding the line. Now the Romans do a couple of things, I think, that suggest that the Republic, or the aristocrats, maybe even a small oligarchic circle that's now running Rome, are trying to do to show their confidence in their new sovereignty. So one of the things that happened, supposedly in the first year of the Republic, is the inauguration of a new temple on the Capitoline Hill. A temple that has been under construction under the late kings, but it's actually completed and inaugurated by the first consuls, and that is the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. This is an extraordinarily large temple, probably the largest temple in all of Italy at this point, and a big temple even by the standards of the broader Greek world. It does not exist today, but you can go to the Capitoline Hill today, go to the Capitoline Museum, and actually see the huge tufa foundations that they were sinking deep down into the Capitoline Hill to support this truly massive building. And the size of just these foundations, again, you can see it. All this was underground. They give us a sense of excuse me, how truly monumental this building would have been. So completing it and inaugurating it clearly is a sign of confidence by this new Republican regime, a new regime without a king, but still willing to complete this big project that clearly is this is a statement, right? You can see this building for miles and miles. So certainly this is a statement of civic pride, of the power of whoever controls this community to mobilize resources and labor to construct this edifice. And the Capitoline Hill really is at the confluence of political and military and religious power in Republican Rome. So not only do you have this incredibly important temple to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, which also contains space for two other important gods, the so-called Capitoline triad of Juno, associated with Hera, so Juno and Jupiter are consorts, and then Minerva, who will eventually become associated with Athena. So you have this important religious space. The Capitoline is also very, very important for the sort of military space. It actually shows some archaic fortifications, some of which you can actually still see at the top. And more importantly, later in the Republic, and maybe even already by the early Republic, it is the site of the levy. So when the Roman citizen army is mustered, the actual mustering initially will eventually take place on the Capitoline. At an earlier point, it may have taken place on the Campus Martius, the field of Mars, but in Polybius's day, it takes place on the Capitoline. The Capitoline is also one of the places where the Roman people vote. So therefore, I have this confluence of a very important religious space, very important military space, and very important political space, and of course, one of the most prominent terrain features, not just in Rome, but really anyone in that part of the Tiber Plain. And now you've got this huge temple that puts a huge human landmark on what had already been an extremely prominent topographic feature. So that's one thing that the New Republic completes, and indeed Roman memory associates the first consuls with the completion of the temple of Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus. A second thing that is done, it seems almost right away, is to re-establish diplomatic relations with Carthage, in that a treaty is signed, and the Romans believe it's signed in 509, defining Rome and Carthage, their spheres of influence. Carthage does acknowledge Roman hegemony over Latium, which may suggest that the late kings had managed to establish a degree of either, if not control, a degree of hegemony over that region. And the Romans also acknowledge the Carthaginian sphere of influence, which is actually much bigger. It involves things like Sicily and Sardinia. So, in terms of the Carthaginian sphere of influence versus the Roman sphere of influence, this treaty, which the historian Polybius, who's in Rome in the 160s and 150s, he claims he's seen it, and that some people have helped him read the archaic Latin. This also suggests a new government that realizes that the overthrowing of the kings may have created some diplomatic ruptures, and therefore moves to repair those ruptures, including with what may be, at this point, one of the most prosperous and powerful city-states in the Mediterranean, Carthage. So that's another thing that the new Republican government does almost right away. So a final feature of this early Republican government is, however, oligarchy. In that, from a very early point, a small number of aristocratic families, the people who have, again, staged a coup, uncharitably, to overthrow the last king, seek to band together and form a closed aristocracy that will be referred to as the patricians. And the patricians are, again, self-defined, self-styled, roughly 25 families who simply say, we are the only people who can control can hold magisterial office and who can hold priesthoods, and no one else can. This group of patricians therefore seeks to dominate political and sacral office in Rome, and they will successfully do so for the first roughly 140 years or so of the Republic. And so this means that the early Republic it's definitely not a democracy, but it really does seem to be a narrow, self-defined oligarchy. And oligarchies, particularly oligarchies that are run by a closed aristocratic caste, are oftentimes not very stable. They're simply not inclusive enough to really sort of govern effectively. And so therefore, while we as I earlier in this video talked about the military ineffectiveness of the Roman state, it also is going to be politically dysfunctional, precisely because there are a lot of people and a lot of families who aren't happy with the rule or the governance of this closed aristocratic class. And indeed, the early period of Roman history is defined by periodic, iterative social clashes between the patricians and then the plebeians, who that term refers to sort of everybody else, although the plebeians themselves seem to have different factions. On one hand, there are very wealthy plebeians who look at the patricians and say, we own just as much land, we have just as nice clothes, we drink just as nice wine. Why can't we be consul? Why can't we be pontifex? And therefore, they're agitating for the ability to hold office in Rome. There are also plebeians who are just poor, who are oppressed by hunger, who suffer from famine, and who are weighted down by debt, and who are agitating to improve their basic condition. And so what we're going to see, and what we'll talk about in future videos, is what is sometimes termed the struggle of the orders, the struggle between patricians and plebeians. And this struggle, there are a small number of people who think this is sort of overblown or invented, but it's quite deeply rooted in our sources and also matches some of the kind of social strife that we see in Greek city-states. This struggle is going to define the early years of Roman history. It may actually hamstring the military effectiveness of the early Roman state, and its resolution is going to shape what Roman Republican institutions look like. And so we'll talk about that in future videos.